Two top cave divers were exploring an underwater maze that no one had ever reached before. On their way back, they discovered that the only exit had been completely blocked. One of them could not believe it, and swam back into the depths of the cave to double-check the route. But the guideline clearly showed that they had not gone the wrong way. However, when he returned to the blocked exit, something strange happened. His companion, who had just been beside him, had vanished into thin air. In the pitch-black, silent cave, he was left completely alone, with only 5 minutes of air remaining in his tank. Today, we are telling the story of the famous Sherlock Spring cave diving accident in the United States. Sherlock Spring is located near Wakulla Springs State Park in Florida, USA. On the surface, it looks like nothing more than a spring just over 50 meters in diameter. A calm pond, less than 9 meters deep, hid a narrow fissure 40 meters below the surface, so tight that only a single diver could squeeze through sideways. Beyond this fissure lay a massive limestone cave system, plunging to a depth of 91 meters. And this fissure was the cave's only entrance and exit. On November 17, 1991, the world's top cave diving organization, WKPP, sent 8 core members to explore Sherlock Spring. The team was divided into 4 groups. The first 2 groups were responsible for laying guideline ropes and placing decompression tanks along the route. The third group, consisting of WKPP leader Bill Gavin and veteran diver Parker Turner, followed a pre-planned schedule. They would traverse the main passage in 40 minutes, spend approximately 25 minutes mapping and surveying at a depth of around 90 meters, and then return to the cave entrance, performing decompression stops at different depths. The entire dive was expected to last about 3 hours. At 10 a.m., the 2 divers entered the water right on schedule. At that time, the cave's visibility reached an astonishing 18 meters. The current was stable, and everything seemed unbelievably smooth. After passing through the narrow squash restriction area, they entered an uncharted section of the cave and began mapping the new passageways. More than 20 minutes later, the task was complete, and the 2 started their return. At that point, they had more than enough air to safely reach the surface. But during the return, they suddenly noticed that the water ahead was becoming increasingly murky. When they reached the squash restriction area, a chill ran down their spines. The guideline, which had been firmly fixed to the cave floor, was gone. More precisely, it had been buried under a mass of rocks and silt. Even worse, the fallen rock had completely sealed the only exit. They desperately tried to pull the rope, but it would not budge. The passageway that had been perfectly safe just minutes ago had, in a matter of tens of minutes, turned into an underwater tomb. Bill immediately swam back into the depths of the cave to check if they had gone the wrong way, but the guideline showed that the route was entirely correct. They were truly trapped. Confused and desperate, Bill could only return the way he came. But when he reached the collapse, horror-struck, Parker was gone. In the pitch-black darkness, he was completely alone. At that moment, the air remaining in his tank would barely last him 5 more minutes. Meanwhile, on the surface, support diver George also sensed that something was wrong. According to the plan, Bill and Parker should have already begun their decompression stops and started ascending. But no bubbles appeared on the surface. George immediately jumped in to search. However, the cave had become so murky that he could only reach a point 50 meters from the entrance at most, far from the restriction area. As a result, he had no way of knowing that the passage had been blocked. By this time, Bill, trapped and alone, was on the brink of despair. Suddenly, he noticed an extremely narrow fissure in the collapsed ceiling. With no other choice, he squeezed through the gap. The struggle to maneuver through the tight space consumed a huge amount of air. Once he made it through, Bill immediately rushed to swap his tank for the spare. But as he attempted the switch, he suddenly realized that Parker's spare tank hadn't been touched at all. This meant that Parker had been unable to escape. Shortly after, Bill spotted a regulator and tank not far away. In that moment, he finally understood what had happened. When George arrived, he found Bill performing decompression stops. Bill's entire demeanor was vacant and dazed. All he could do was hand George a writing slate, on which it was clearly written, "Parker was dead." That afternoon, the rescue team entered the cave several times to search, but the visibility was so poor that they could not find Parker. It wasn't until the next morning, when the murky silt finally settled, that rescuers discovered Parker's body, 5 meters below the ceiling of the main chamber. The accident shocked the entire diving community. No one could understand how a limestone cave, that had remained stable for millions of years, could suddenly collapse as 2 divers passed through. At first, experts suspected an earthquake, water level changes, or even the aging of the cave structure, but all of these theories were later disproven. It wasn't until 24 years later that Professor Doronov of Florida State University revealed the truth. The real cause of the collapse was the divers' exhaled bubbles. When these bubbles accumulated at the cave ceiling, they altered the balance of buoyancy supporting the surrounding rock. Once the buoyant force was insufficient to hold the weight, the overhead rock could suddenly give way. At the time of the accident, a support diver responsible for decompression stops happened to be breathing and exhaling for an extended period directly above the restriction area. The result, a massive buildup of bubbles triggered the collapse. This was the first confirmed cave collapse in human history, caused by divers breathing bubbles. Afterward, cave diving rules were completely overhauled. Divers were strictly prohibited from remaining for extended periods under the cave ceiling during decompression stops. Many high-risk caves now allow entry only with rebreathers that produce no bubbles. The Sherlock Spring incident made it clear to everyone. In the pitch-black underground world, even the most experienced top-tier divers cannot prevent the arrival of unknown dangers.